This piece expertly explores the psychological depth of passive suicidal ideation, or the desire to not exist, by detailing its triggers, the cognitive processes involved, and practical coping mechanisms.
And it does so with such necessary clarity and empathy. I mean, honestly, this is already a very, very strong submission.
It really is.
The way it handles such a sensitive feeling is, well, the expertise is obvious. Our job here isn't about correcting content at all. It's really just to ensure the structure maximizes the impact of that powerful, validating message.
Right. Just some fine-tuning.
Exactly. So let's just jump right into the big picture. Powerful, global, and cultural example, specifically the concepts of jihatsu and ikigai, should probably be integrated throughout the psychological discussion, rather than being presented as this isolated segment.
I see what you mean.
It would reinforce the universality.
Yeah, because right now, the material makes this really strong case for the link between societal pressure and, individual emotional load.
It does.
But that fascinating discussion of johatsu, the evaporated people who disappear to escape, what was it, unbearable social demand?
That's the one.
Well, that part feels like its own self-contained chapter. It's powerful, for sure, but it does feel a little divorced from the moment-to-moment psychological breakdown that follows it.
Exactly. It feels like the crucial societal context is presented as sort of an interesting fact, rather than the heavy engine that's actually driving the personal triggers the reader is feeling. The stress, the burnout.
Okay.
I mean, if the core argument is that this wish to disappear is often an externally driven cry for rest and safety and not just some internal failing, then we should use that cultural framing as a powerful macro lens right from the beginning.
I understand the goal there, to validate the reader by showing the problem is systemic, not just personal. But let me push back on that for just a second.
Please?
Isn't there a risk that mentioning something as intense as johatsu, people literally disappearing, too early on might actually overwhelm the reader before we've even established their own emotional baseline?
That's a really valid concern about the pacing, but I think the key is all in the framing. We don't have to dwell on the tragic outcomes right away.
Okay.
We just need to introduce the concept of unbearable social demand as the source of the exhaustion. So when you first discuss how this desire to not exist is triggered by emotional exhaustion and stress,
You mention it right there.
you mention it right there. You explicitly say that this feeling of running on empty is compounded by this global weight, or what some cultures call unbearable social demand.
So by doing that, you instantly globalize the reader's fatigue. It's not just some flaw in their personal resilience, it's a globally recognized struggle.
Precisely. It shows the stress isn't self-generated. It's, socially enforced. It gives the reader permission to feel tired.
Because you've identified the external source.
You've identified the external source of the relentless pressure. For instance, instead of just listing stress and exhaustion, you could write something like, "This feeling of profound fatigue is often a reaction to persistent, unbearable social demand, a pressure so heavy that in some cultures it leads to the phenomenon of johatsu, or the desire to simply evaporate."
That framing makes the macro context functional. It becomes a diagnostic tool, not just background info.
And we can apply the exact same logic in the solution section by linking the positive action back to ikigai.
Okay, right.
When presenting behavioral activation, that strategy of finding one small, meaningful action, we should explicitly link that small act back to the Japanese concept of ikigai, a reason for living.
So you elevate simple self-care. Instead of just find one small thing you enjoy, we say this small act is your personal reclamation of ikigai.
Yes, it gives the simple act of, playing a favorite song or cooking a meal much greater philosophical depth.
Right.
It takes it from being a simple self-care tip and turns it into a profound act of self-reclamation. For someone struggling with the desire to not exist, that infusion of meaning is incredibly powerful. It confirms the fight is philosophical, not just behavioral.
That structural integration is vital. I see that now. It means the piece begins by globally validating the struggle and ends by globally validating the steps toward recovery.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's pivot from structure to language, which is, just as crucial given the sensitivity here.
I agree. The material successfully normalizes the feeling, talking about it initially as a tender and deeply human feeling, but then the transition into the very specific clinical labels.
It can be a little jarring.
Yeah, passive suicidal ideation, cognitive distortion called catastrophizing, and depersonalization. We go from holding the reader's hand to, giving them a clipboard.
A clipboard and a diagnostic manual. Yeah, that tonal shift. So to sustain that initial tenor, the introduction of technical psychological terminology needs to be framed as an explanatory tool, not a clinical.
So you provide an immediate, gentle translation for the audience.
We need a connecting phrase, something that gently bridges the conversational language to the scientific. We want the science to feel like an extension of the empathy, not a barrier to it.
The goal is seamless integration, not interruption. We want to avoid the reader feeling like they've suddenly been categorized or labeled.
Precisely. And let's look at the terminology itself. Like, why is catastrophizing so central here? It's the specific mental mechanism that slams the door shut on hope, isn't it?
It is. It's the tendency to see the current pain, the stress, the fatigue, as permanent and all-consuming. It convinces the person there is no way out.
Which is the immediate precursor to the desire to not exist.
Exactly.
So when we introduce that process, we have to define it clearly and kindly. Instead of just dropping the word in, we should explain the function first. For example, say something like, the mind, seeking desperately to make the unbearable stop, may engage in a specific function called catastrophizing, and then immediately define it. This is the cognitive distortion of instantly and illogically expecting the worst possible outcome.
By defining it up front as a function or a distortion, you make it feel less like a permanent diagnosis and more like a temporary glitch in the mental wiring that can be fixed.
Yes, it confirms the thought is warped, not the person, and that affirmation is just essential.
It really is.
We can use the same principle for depersonalization. The material already does a beautiful job describing this as a numb, floating state where the world feels distant.
It's a very effective description of dissociation.
Right. So when you introduce the word depersonalization, connect it directly back to that physical experience. Describe it as the brain's immediate defense mechanism that shows up as that numb, floating state you mentioned.
So you can explain that the mind is just trying to shut down excess stimulation when the emotional input is too much to handle.
That's such a powerful reframe. It makes the technical term feel like an understandable biological survival response, not just another intimidating word in a textbook. It immediately affirms that the body is simply trying to cope with being overloaded.
Okay, yeah. You're just offering the scientific explanation for a profoundly human experience. The science should always serve the empathy.
Always. Okay, so moving into the third critical area, let's focus on the actionable section at the end.
Right. The discussion identifies these core deficits: running on empty, emotional fatigue, and loneliness. The list of coping mechanisms is strong, but they currently feel a bit generic.
I agree. The final section on coping strategies is strong, but grounding these specific self-care acts directly in the psychological triggers we just identified would significantly increase their relevance and their impact.
Right now, strategies like journaling or micro-rest feel like a helpful checklist, but not a targeted intervention guide.
We need to turn that helpful list into a precise self-defense strategy. We should explicitly group or frame the strategies by the problem they solve.
So the reader sees the coping mechanism as a deliberate and targeted act against their specific overload state. The intervention has to be explicitly connected to the injury.
Exactly. Let's start with fatigue, because that's identified as the physical fuel for the emotional burnout. How do we sharpen the focus on micro-rest?
That wonderful strategy of taking just 5 minutes to breathe, or nap, or just sit without judgment.
We should explicitly frame it as the foundational antidote to that cycle of physical fatigue fueling emotional fatigue. We need to emphasize that this permission to pause isn't a luxury.
It directly counters the state of being running on empty.
Yes, and we can even link it back to the Jihatsu context. It's necessary physiological medicine, giving the mind permission to release that unbearable social demand, even if it's just for 5 minutes.
That gives the small break the immense significance it deserves. It makes 5 minutes of rest feel like an act of resistance, not weakness.
It's about giving the user permission to deload the system without any guilt.
Okay, and what about strengthening the concept of connection to counter that quiet epidemic of isolation you mentioned earlier?
We can really strengthen that strategy by explicitly referencing the Minister of Loneliness concept from earlier and the societal need to fight isolation.
Okay.
Suggest that this act of reaching out isn't just about getting perspective. It is actively retethering oneself to the world to counter the isolating effects of depersonalization.
So connection becomes this deliberate, world-reaffirming act that pulls the mind out of that numbing, floating state.
Exactly. It transforms a simple suggestion, call a friend, into a necessary defense against mental disconnection. That makes the stakes crystal clear.
And high, yeah.
And finally, let's make sure sensory grounding speaks directly to the cognitive spiral, to the catastrophizing.
Right. Because catastrophizing is the mind running uncontrollably toward the worst-case future scenario. So the solution has to be pulling the mind into the immediate safe present.
Absolute. For sensory grounding, emphasize its power to pull the mind back from those spiraling thoughts. Make it explicit that by focusing intensely on what you see or hear or feel right now,
They're linking your senses to safety and the present.
it's immediate counter-programming. It's a circuit breaker for the mind's tendency to run away from reality.
By connecting the action to the specific psychological injury, the entire set of coping mechanisms transforms from a generic list into a deeply personalized and targeted toolkit.
You create a clear roadmap. If you feel X, catastrophize. Use Y, sensory grounding, because it does Z, pulls you into the present. It becomes that simple and direct.
Okay, fantastic. So we've established 3 major areas for structural and tonal strengthening. The depth of expertise in this submission is so clear, and the empathy is already there.
Agreed. We're just focused on structural refinement to maximize reader impact and ensure that initial empathy is sustained all the way through the technical explanations and the practical coping strategies.
So the main actionable takeaways for the listener are threefold. First, integrate the global and cultural context of Jihatsu and Ikigai throughout the piece to validate that external pressure is what drives internal fatigue.
Second, smooth the introduction of clinical terms like catastrophizing and depersonalization. Immediately define them in gentle human terms. Remember, we want the science to validate the feeling, not label the person.
And third, sharpen the actionable coping strategies by explicitly framing them as targeted countermeasures against the specific triggers you identified: loneliness, emotional fatigue, and cognitive spiraling.
This work is already profoundly necessary and sensitive. It just needs these structural threads woven more tightly together to ensure its vital message is delivered with maximum clarity and a sustained connection. It's excellent work.
It really is.
And we look forward to seeing how you weave these threads together. Please, send the revised version back to us when you feel ready for another critique.